one thing that President Trump has to have some concern about is he coined the phrase America first, and he was going to focus on national policies and so on. And yet here he is up to his knees or neck in really messy foreign policy. Think about all the places around the world right now where we're involved. But there's an analogous situation. In 1989, the Americans invaded Panama and took Manuel Noriega, the president of Panama, back to Washington and tried him for many, if not most, of the same crimes as Maduro of Venezuela is going to be tried. That was controversial, but it was considered to be a limited event. We were only trying to remove a criminal, and he had done many of the same things and some worse things than Maduro is accused of. We didn't interfere with the operation of the government. We took Noriega, tried him, and sentenced him to prison for crimes. It was a criminal case. As long as that's the case against Maduro, that's one thing. But now what we have discovered is it's not the intervention that causes the trouble, it's what happens after the intervention. Think about it. We overthrew Pinochet in Chile. We overthrew Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And every one of those cases, what happened after the removal of the dictator was turmoil and violence. And that's what we have to be afraid of in Venezuela now. It's the after effect, what happens afterwards. And you raised the important question. What are we going to do now? The Vice President Rodriguez has now taken the oath of office, but she was elected in a crooked election where Maduro was the presidential candidate. So if we endorse that government, we're endorsing the vice president of the government for which we've kidnapped the president. If we don't endorse Rodriguez, if we endorse this other person, Machado, who's the Nobel Prize winner, she actually won the election probably. If we endorse her, we would be putting her in charge of a government filled with, to put it bluntly, crooked people who were part of the Maduro regime. So there's a real pickle presenting itself to us in this, what happens after the event. And I mentioned all those other times that led to turmoil overturning a leader. We've got to make sure that what happens in Venezuela is peaceful, not just starts another civil war, and because then we will be responsible for not making progress, but causing the downfall and disaster in another country. It's really, really important for the Trump administration to be very careful in the next few days. They're going to have to take a position. They're going to have to endorse someone. We're apparently going to send in Americans to work on the petroleum industry there, the wells and so on, which means we'll have Americans in Venezuela where they could be vulnerable to turmoil or civil war if it breaks out. So as troubling as it is now, I'm afraid to use that old expression, you ain't seen nothing yet. It could become even more dicey if we send in American business people and American engineers to help work on the oil industry, which is what we said we want to do. And if we don't send in American troops, and if we do send in American troops, then there's just going to be the devil to pay there, because I don't think any Americans want to, quote unquote, occupy Venezuela. So we're just sort of teetering on the edge of some sort of disaster and things could go well, but this requires really, really careful and subtle policy and execution of policy by the administration. Well, look at the issues that all the public opinion polls reveal Americans are focused on. The term affordability, which is another word for inflation and prices and unemployment. Okay. Immigration, crime. Immigration and crime seem to be improved as far as conditions. The economy worries people terribly. But if you look at a ranking of issues which Americans consider to be the highest priority, foreign policy is pretty low on the ranking. Yet, as you've identified correctly, every time you turn around, there's the Ukraine, there's the question of Venezuela, there's the question of the Middle East. So foreign policy issues are demanding attention, and the president is the chief foreign policy officer in addition to being the commander in chief. So he has to address those foreign policy issues. But there are really, really pressing domestic issues which are much higher on the priority list of Americans. And even someone as energetic as President Trump can't address everything everywhere. So you've got to set priorities. And wherever he sets priorities, something will have to get short shrift. And that's going to be something to look for. Will we steer away from foreign policy? Will we put off domestic policy questions to focus on foreign policy? He's got some really, really tough decisions to make. And we're in 2026, which means there are congressional elections coming this fall. These are what are called the midterm elections. The entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. Now, if those elections go against the Republicans and the Democrats take control of one or both houses of the Congress, President Trump's going to have a miserable last 2 years with with a Democratic controlled Congress. If the Republicans keep control of Congress, that'll be better for him. But he will be, no matter what happens, to use that phrase that political scientists use, he will be an increasingly lame duck as he approaches the last year of his administration. So whatever happens with the issues that you and I've been talking about, he has some really tough times ahead of him. And again, it's going to require an enormous amount of attention to deal with the foreign policy questions, but also with the pressing domestic issues. If things go well, it will redound to his credit and the Republicans will benefit. If things turn really sour, or if the American people think that he's neglecting these pressing domestic issues to focus on foreign policy, it won't hurt him specifically, but it will be terrible for the Republicans because these off-year elections, they're known as referenda on the president. In other words, he's not up for election. So what do you do if you want to punish President Trump? You vote against the Republicans. What do you do if you want to reward President Trump? You vote for the Republicans. So these off-year elections are, to some degree, referenda on the president. And typically, in these off-year elections, the president's party loses quite a few seats in the House. The average for, I believe it's the 20th century and into the 21st, the average is 20 seats. Well, the Republicans have a 2 or a 3 seat majority. And by the way, you might take a look, a Republican congressman died today, and he takes that 3 or 4 vote majority in the House down to just 1 or 2. I just saw it before we spoke from somewhere out west, I think. A Republican congressman died. Well, that means that temporarily that's 1 fewer Republicans, and their majority shrinks even more temporarily. But the point is, if the average for presidential party seats, in this case, Republican seats in the off year election, is a loss of upward of 20, well, that would be disastrous for President Trump because you put a strong Democratic majority in the House, and they're not going to do anything that President wanted. I mean, they would consider it a matter of honor to repulse him. So this will be an enormously important off-year election for the Republicans and especially for President Trump.